The kinds of activity disabled people are involved in say the late 70s, which led to a springboard for the coalition, was locally based issues. And in Rochdale, for example, we were involved in housing and personal assistance issues and things around access, but with a particular focus on pedestrianisation, because at that period there was a lot of activity in developing pedestrianisation schemes, but it was very, very localised activities. And the thinking behind it, however, was had a national kind of input and focus through UPIAS, that's the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. And one or two of us, and it was one or two of us, were actually members of that organisation. And we fed the politics, the ideology from that organisation into our local campaigns. But it was a very, very radical group, and it wasn't the kind, it was very, very difficult to actually recruit people into the organisation. But nevertheless, the actual thinking behind it, the opposition to segregation, in particular the opposition to residential institutions, special schools and so on, they were kind of issues that would get support of other disabled people, but the actual political agenda of UPIAS was very, very difficult to kind of recruit people as actual members. But the political impetus came from that. So we were very much kind of separated in a sense from each other in these localised activities. But towards it must have been about 1979, Dorothy Whitaker, who was appointed at Greater Manchester Council for Voluntary Service, I believe to set up a Greater Manchester Association for disabled people, made it part of a role, if you like, to go around and talk to disabled people to see what they actually felt about this and wanted, and gathered during those discussions that disabled people didn't want an organisation for. At the same time as she was looking around in the different boroughs, she was able to, through having these resources, put disabled people in touch with each other, so that our campaigns that were occurring in Rochdale over housing gradually spread to other boroughs and eventually got a Greater Manchester focus. So the organisations we had in Rochdale were in a sense duplicated to a Greater Manchester organisation in relation to housing and a Greater Manchester organisation in relation to access. And there are a number of campaigns, for example, on pedestrianisation, which disabled people from different boroughs actually got behind. So we had this focus then of disabled people from different boroughs finding that we had issues in common, and through kind of collective strength also realised that we could be far more effective if we actually got together. Also, there's the kind of thing that radical individuals, radical ideas were not so widely diffused at that time, and so it was good to have other people who were like-minded, which may be very difficult to find in a local setting. You had to operate, you had to think differently. You went back a number of years if you were involved with the local group, and you had to change your language, change the way you operated and so on. So it was quite good to be able to kind of talk a different kind of language through meeting other people from different boroughs that were in tune with your radical ideas. So that in a sense was partly where the actual basis for a Greater Manchester organisation came from. But it was also through having knowledge of what occurred in Canada in 1979 in setting up the Disabled People's International in opposition to the International Rehab International, wasn't it? Rehabilitation International that refused disabled people kind of 50% representation on it. And when DPI came out of that, and when one of the representatives, I think, from Derbyshire brought back literature and information, we had all kinds of information there about the way disabled people were thinking and organising in relation to that international group and to setting up an international group of disabled people. We also got information about coalitions in Canada, which was circulated to some of us, and so we had a look at the way they were organised. And personally, I was quite impressed with the idea of a coalition of disabled people with different impairments who had been previously segregated through or separated through medical diagnostic categories, such as you've got the blind here, you've got the deaf there, and you've got people with mobility impairments here, and you were further segregated through being spastic or multiple sclerosis or muscular dystrophy and so on. And so the actual coalition, the coming together of those different groups on issues and campaigns, that was quite impressed with that. I wasn't too impressed with the idea that they were consumer-orientated organisation, that as consumers of services we have rights. That certainly at the time that seemed to be a backward step, not very radical. And also I wasn't impressed at the time with the talking about civil rights either. I didn't think that was too radical. And I thought that was very much getting too bound up with the system, instead of kind of getting a little bit deeper and overturning the system, rather than getting, completely bound up with it. And I still have those kind of doubts about this now. That's why I think that rights are just a partial kind of thing. However, shortly after that, in 1981, International Year of Disabled People, Derbyshire took the initial step to kind of set up a coalition, but one that was culturally more in tune with the way disabled people thought here rather than in North America. And those two things eventually, the pressures of those three things really, the fact that we had an international organisation which we needed a national organisation to relate to, which eventually was BCODP, and the fact that we had a regional organisation, an embryo one in the Derbyshire Coalition that was setting up, that again brought these different groups of disabled people previously isolated together with the fact that we had already kind of made these contacts and links through using the resources of Greater Manchester Council of Voluntary Services on issues like housing, opposition to residential institutions, pedestrianisation and so on. The fact that those three things came together, I think, laid the foundations for us thinking about, we weren't clear in our thinking, that we needed something bigger than our local kind of activities. We needed something bigger so that we can fit into the wider picture. And I think that what the main thinking behind this again was UPS, that we kind of got into our UPS more when we thought about global things, in, wider political kind of issues. It was the kind of the people that were involved in UPS that got together, thought politically about those issues and took them forward.
During 1980, I was given a brief to look at what should happen during the International Year of Disabled People in 1981 in the county of Greater Manchester. I was working at Greater Manchester Council of Voluntary Services, and my concern at the time was that whether what should happen was going to be some sort of patronising events for disabled people, or whether what we should attempt to do is to find out what disabled people wanted from the year. So I spent some time going and trying to talk to people and say, what should happen this year. I mean, GMCDP feels it's actually got some resources to make some things happen during the year. Unfortunately, I met key disabled people who told me what they didn't want during the year. What they didn't want was somebody to obviously provide events for them. What they didn't want were grand festivals. But if resources could be used, the way they wanted those resources to promote some of the issues, which were the beginnings of independent living, to promote issues about accessible transport, housing with the required support, and other major issues, even the access issues. So, I mean, met some of these key people, but in different districts of the county. There were obviously people who'd really got that vision in Rochdale and people who'd got that similar idea in Salford. And what I was able to do, because I had a county brief and I had, resources, I was being paid to make some links with disabled people. I was able to actually, I suppose, introduce people who got that vision and some kind of political understanding about change together, and say to them, somebody else over there on the other side of the county is equally thinking like you, and had the ability to introduce people to that. And so during the year, as well as each local district, many of the local districts did actually have their own committees. And I mean, some of those committees are still going today, because BADAC, the Berry Group, came out of Internationally of Disabled People, and Manchester Disability Forum came directly out of the meetings there. So some of those district groups are still going, but the other thing is that we shared ideas across the county that year, and we got groups going around the housing and around the highways issues and transport issues, and people made links with one another, I think. And at the end of that, therefore, we had some groups of people who were still prepared to go on talking about fundamental issues. And in particular, I think particularly some housing developments directly came out of some of those groups, from people talking. And so the year carried on in a way. We didn't have a year that was just a legacy of events or fates or flag waving. What we did was actually had a year which then led on to long-term, long-standing developments around policy issues for disabled people. I think my role was really, it was fortunate. I worked for a county organisation and I'd got money and resources to enable me, I suppose, to be able to convene meetings and buy money to buy venues, provide transport for people. And I suppose I acted in a way as a catalyst. I had the ability to do that. And fortunately, in my first year, I met some, key. I mean, Ken Lumb certainly was one of the people in the first year tripped me up and said, look, what we don't want is, but what is important is. And then met other people. I mean, it was Kevin Hyett in Salford. And that do link them together. And I suppose while the coalition came about, that after we talked about a lot of these policy issues, there was still a feeling that instead of just talking about issues, do we need an organisation that can take on board any issues that affect our lives? And we knew about the Derbyshire Coalition at the time, and we had links there. So a few key people agreed just to meet, often in the evenings, at the St Thomas Centre where GMCDP was based. On occasional few Saturdays we spent time, about 10 people, just sitting and talking about how can we create, not exactly what Derbyshire created, but what can we create in Greater Manchester, which is a sort of constituted as a group of disabled people, I mean, who together can address issues that come up that affect their lives, and how can we resource that? That was the other issue. And so we ended up with one very big meeting in County Hall that was fortunately very well attended. There must have been 100 plus people there, disabled people, and asking people to look at the issues. And at the end of that, there's a vote of confidence given to actually say, go ahead, try and have a coalition, an executive. And that year was then spent trying to work out, I mean, how would it be constituted, who'd be on the committee, and where would we get the resources, because we knew it was important to actually have some staff and some long-term resources. And fortunately, I mean, the GMC, the Greater Manchester Council, was still there and had access to resources. And within the first year, we managed to get funding, which led to the appointment of 3 staff. And then at that point, I mean, in many ways, then I began to pull out, because that resourcing then was invested in disabled people, and it didn't really need GMCBS or my ability to be the catalyst. So I sort of moved on from there.
How do you think GMCDP has influenced things for disabled people over the 10 years?
I think actually probably looking at it, where do I think the most? I think the influence is it's an organisation that's always prepared, I suppose, in a way, to stick its collective head up over the parapet and actually sort of sometimes question the status quo, and I think that's the most important thing it's actually done. I mean, it's something that's always been able to look to question things as they arose at disabled people, to question statutory authorities doing things together, and I think that's really where its impetus has been. It's been able to actually, shall I say, affect policies, because it's actually had policies of its own, and it's been able, if it's disliked a policy, to produce either a document or a statement or a demonstration that's of equal weight and worth to what it actually is contesting. And I think that's probably where the influence is most, because I think some of the smaller groups struggle in having that confidence to assemble either their thoughts or themselves in a way that is then actually recognised and actually sets other people back and makes them stop and think. And the coalition seems to have had the ability not only maybe sometimes to actually question what other people may be doing in the name of disabled people, but it's also been able sometimes to come up with either some of the solutions or the answers, and not just be critical. And I think its information base has been very, very important as well. The fact that it's been able to produce a newsletter that's sometimes been very controversial, but it's a newsletter that's really sort of provoked a lot of thought in that.
Well, the idea for the start of the coalition in Greater Manchester really came from a meeting that was held in Rochdale by the 3 members who were there then of UPS and Dorothy Whitaker. Now, Dorothy had been a field worker for GMCDP, and for a couple of years prior to that meeting, we'd started organising in Greater Manchester, started working on issues like housing and highways, and Dorothy had proved invaluable in putting activists, disabled activists, in contact with each other who were flung all over the 10 districts and wouldn't normally meet each other. She was an invaluable source of that kind of information. And at this particular meeting, we were worried what would happen if Dorothy changed her job. If she wasn't the person in that job, would it all collapse? And what could we do to see that it didn't? And the very first thought was, disabled people needed to do essentially what Dorothy was doing for us, this kind of coordinating activity. So rather than us just look inward at our individual battles that we were fighting, we somehow needed to coordinate on a Greater Manchester level. And it was felt that the best way to do that would be to have a coalition. Now, that not to say the next day a coalition was formed, because we felt it was best not to try and impose any kind of solution on disabled people in Manchester. They needed to come to that decision themselves. And what we did was we used Dorothy's contacts to bring these various activists together. I think we had an impromptu organisation called something like the Greater Manchester Disability Action Group or some such name, to work on campaigns and to start working together. And it was from that group that we decided to press forward with a coalition.
And what happened then? How did the coalition actually start?
Well, what happened then was that this group set up a steering committee with the intention of establishing a coalition to discuss some of its aims, some of its objectives, and basically to organise an inaugural meeting, to have a big meeting in County Hall where all disabled people that were interested would be invited. And that first meeting, that inaugural meeting, took a lot of organising because we'd never really organised like that before. And from that first meeting, the idea would be that the discussions would form the basis of the coalition. That from those discussions we would form the constitution, the aims, the objectives, and the coalition would start from that day forward.
So how did you get your first premises?
Pardon?
How did you get your first premises? How did all that happen? Your first office?
The first office?
Yes,
How did we get from that point? Yeah, I mean, how we got from simply being a collection of activists and volunteers to being quite a sound organisation. Basically, it was a lot of hard work. Very early on in the coalition's thoughts, it was agreed that if we were going to survive and if we were going to have any purpose, we needed paid employees. Most of us had had experiences in other types of organisations, in the disability movement of one sort or another. We all came from different backgrounds. I came from, if you like, the disabled motorist line, and most of us were working in organisations that had no paid workers. And we realised that the organisations that were successful, the able-bodied controlled organisations, all had paid workers. And the disabled controlled organisations didn't have paid workers. And we felt we needed the stability of paid workers. So a lot of our efforts in the early year was simply to find ways of getting paid workers. Now, at the beginning, when we only were able to get small amounts of money, work was done part-time by members, filling in gaps to develop the organisation. But eventually, when we got a more substantial grant from ADMAR and GMC, that began to form the basis of the coalition. And we were able to employ first 1 full-time, then 2, and then 3 workers. It gave us the basis of which to build the coalition, to the extent that fairly soon the coalition is made up of, like a core, the original 3 posts, and a series of projects which are separately financed.
Right. Well, my involvement with the beginnings of the coalition, I wasn't involved in the initial meetings that, if you like, talked about the concept of the coalition. My involvement came at the first public meeting, which was called Strategies for a Coalition, and that had obviously been put together by a group of people who'd previously been involved discussing the issues and the need for such an organisation. I went along to the Strategies for a Coalition meeting because a friend of mine, Neville Strowger, said I should go, so I went. And it was all totally new to me. In practice, it was all totally new to me because I hadn't had any of the discussions around the politics of disability. I hadn't had connection with the people who were talking about these things. I hadn't had sight of any of the documents where these things were being written about. So although I had been involved in, what should we say, disabled people's organisations, i.e. controlled by disabled people, not from a political perspective. And I think I kind of split the policy and the practice bit, because in practice I knew about the issues, but I hadn't had the opportunity to kind of develop them and refine them and so on in discussion with other people. And I think I knew about them in quite a naive way, but in a way that was a reflection of the experiences of my life as a disabled person, having gone through a special school system and a mainstream school system, and into open employment. I'd certainly come up against very many barriers, so I knew what it meant in terms of day-to-day living, But in terms of applying it politically and looking at the situation of disabled people, all that was very new to me. And I think it was kind of exemplified by a comment that someone made to me when we were planning an open meeting on the politics of disability, and when we were planning it, someone said to me, well, you're saying the right things, they said, but I'm damned if I know why you're saying them. And I think that illustrated that the experience, but not the exposure to the politics. So that was my first involvement, the strategies for a coalition, the public meeting that was held in County Hall in Manchester, 1982, 83, I can't remember exactly, probably 83. And at that meeting, we talked about such things as discrimination and segregation, words that I'd never applied to disabled people, but instantly recognised it on the whole. There were a few things that you know sort of took a bit more thinking about and a bit more discussion, but the other thing that meeting did was form a steering group for to establish a coalition. And I was nominated onto the steering group, I can't remember who by, and that was the beginning, I suppose, of my involvement. And my major involvement in that particular year was around seeking funding for the coalition and working with Dorothy Whitaker, who was the development worker at the Greater Manchester Council for Voluntary Service, to try to negotiate funding and to look for funding, seek funding sources, and having identified sources, try to negotiate funding for staff, for buildings, and quite an education it was as well, I must admit. Do you want to ask me another question?
Yeah. When you got that involved, what did it start to mean to you as a disabled person? Did it change anything for you personally?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I started getting involved, and once I'd started getting involved, I kind of got more and more and more involved. And what it meant to me, I think it has to be placed in context in what was happening in my life at the time as well. And I was more or less just about seeking a divorce with two quite young children, 2 and 4 or 5, I should think. And I think the coalition sounds very worthy, but it did give a purpose to my life other than the domestic routine and what I was trying to do at home, because I hadn't worked since the children had been born, although I'd worked before that. And my life had become very kind of domestically orientated necessarily. And for me personally, there was the validation of my experiences, which I think was very, very important, especially as potentially a single mother with young children. The validation of my experiences as a disabled person and as a woman. But also the feeling that I was also doing something that was of great value and very exciting as well, very new, very exciting, quite a challenge. And I think that probably was a really good balance to what was happening in my life at that time. And not only that, I was making new friends and working alongside people who we were of similar mind on lots of things, and I was discovering that, and I was getting very much supported in that. So in terms of the impact on my personal life, it's very hard to measure the impact that the coalition has had, because I got involved in the coalition very much not from the outside, but very much from an inexperienced level, and my knowledge and my experience and the skills that I gained in being involved with the coalition at all kinds of levels. I mean, from negotiating with local politicians and going on campaigns and demonstrating to helping to set up an office and employ people, and I learned so much. And it's kind of been a bit of a career progression as well for me as well within the coalition, because I worked for the organisation for 6 years and then moved on to work elsewhere and became more involved just in as an officer, a committee member of the coalition. So I think it's been a central part of my life for the last 10, 11, 12 years, and the impact, it's hard to measure.
Development through the coalition with access was lots of issues raised and ideas around making the environment accessible. No point having a building accessible if the environment, the sort of how you get there, and that brought in things like transport and highway structure, infrastructure in terms of people moving around, shop mobility, ideas like that. Greater Manchester is probably has got certain groups within each borough that is responsible for access, but we were involved in transport groups, which took a lot of time and effort. We campaigned against segregated transport systems such as Ring and Ride. We were successful in achieving support for Manchester City in converting 500 FX type taxis to take a wheelchair user by agreeing the council put a condition onto the licence holders that they would convert their taxis. They also gave 100 extra plates so that we could have 100 extra taxis on the ranks, and that obviously increased the opportunities for us to use taxis, and members do use taxis quite a lot, and it's seen as a good form of transport, and now people can use them fairly friendly. They can get in and out quite easily, and to a certain extent in Manchester they are reliable. I had an incident only last week where I tried to get one in another location other than Greater Manchester, and it was a nightmare. In fact, we said we can get you one way but we can't take you back, you know, those kind of attitudes. That was one of the major successes, and the other one we got involved in was involvement from very, very early on was the Metrolink. It was shelled at one stage, but we had quite a heavy involvement then in the early days, and then it was reborn. Very successful transport system in lots and lots of ways. There will be one or two criticisms, but for a lot of mobility impaired people, it works successfully, moving about.
Where would you like?
In terms of the future and transport issues, we take that first. I think it was said once to me that I always wanted access to the top of a double-decker bus. Goodness knows where they got that story from, although I may have said it. And why not? Choices, isn't it? I'd like sometime that to think that people can use transport in the same situation as everyone else does. The cost and strain on people buying personal vehicles is tremendous, and the freedom to move about is greatly held back because of people's attitudes towards having full integrated transport systems. The other part of your question was?
What impact do you think organisations like GMCDP will have? Do you think it's going to be down to them, or do you think legislation will come in?
I have my doubts about the legislation at this stage. I think the organisation will always be pushing for equal rights in society in terms of around transport and access to premises. It's very important. Being part of mainstream activities is what drives a lot of us on, as far as I can feel about it. Get me off.
My involvement in the setting up of the coalition was a result of being conned by Neville Strowger. I'd arrived in Manchester in 1982 as an angry young student, to find myself as the only disabled student on campus, and got involved in trying to bring about changes. And there was this woman that Neville knew who had arranged to meet me on Saturday at this conference that was being held at County Hall about looking at strategies to develop a coalition. And I was stood outside waiting to meet Pat, and she never turned up. But this delightfully charming bloke came up and said, "You must be Martin, I'm Neville, you're coming with me." And the rest, as they say, was history. That from that moment on, having turned up to merely to see what was going on, what views, ideas there were around, got involved in the steering group to lay the foundations for the coalition, and ultimately involved from the launch as an executive member, which I've been ever since, and until I became Chair of Social Services in the City of Manchester and had to leave the executive.
So what were the key issues that the coalition addressed in those days, and how did it go about addressing them?
The key issues that were being addressed at the time, and particularly issues that were important to me, were around access and education. But what was shown through the strategies conference was that all of these issues impact upon each other, that you cannot get into education, for example, without adequate transport, that education is a route into employment, and that with many people not being able to access the education system, they don't get jobs, that other barriers and obstacles all interlink, such as transport, housing. So it was the first time that I'd ever seen a comprehensive view of what disability was, and the fact that there was something that could be done about it. I'd been involved in many single issue campaigns up until that point. It was the first time I'd come across a group of people that had clearly thought through an area of oppression at a time when there was a lot of sloganising going on. There were a lot of pointless campaigns whose purpose seemed to be for nothing other than a feel-good factor. That what we had in the early days of the coalition was a clear understanding of the nature of oppression and clarity of the sorts of actions that could be taken to remove it. And it was the first time in 5, 6, 7 years of political campaigning that I'd ever come across such a well thought out and articulated argument about such a complex issue.
And how do you think that affected disabled people in Greater Manchester? Did you notice a change at that period with the involvement of disabled people and their perceptions about their position in society?
I think what an understanding of those issues led to was an ability to then challenge the many organisations, because I don't think we should ever forget that the coalition emerged at a time when disability was already, and had been for a long period of time, a multi-billion-pound industry, that there were a lot of people that had a vested interest in stopping disabled people from organising, who had a vested interest in ensuring that the view that was put across was that disabled people were either God-cursed, or that there was some medical reason that we would never ever be whole, could never live real lives. And I'm convinced now that that message was perpetuated by people that wanted people to believe that, because otherwise they would have to be exposed to the fact that they had made their livings, and very nice livings, thank you very much, off our backs for a long period of time. And by making it such an issue of personal tragedy and loss rather than political oppression and discrimination, they presented a picture of things that could not be changed, that there was no solution, that the only solution, if you like, was the final solution of death, that was the only way that disability could be addressed. But they weren't on about taking us out and killing us, they were taking us out and locking us up and keeping us shut away. And I think that the impact that the formation of the coalition had was on starting people to believe what many of us had understood and knew, that we weren't useless, we weren't hopeless, that we weren't pathetic creatures that had no contribution to make, but started to give us an opportunity to demonstrate that, to challenge these professionals who had the entire power of the state behind them, and not just the state, but multinational, multi-billion industries supporting them. And what did we have? A couple of dozen angry disabled people meeting in a building that's now been abolished as a result of further cuts in democracy. But who won? And I think we have. We have wrested that issue back onto our agenda. We have given confidence to people. We can see disabled people freely moving around in this city and across the county. We can see people in employment. We can see demands from our allies unheard of in the past. Parents of disabled children demanding the right for their children to go into mainstream schools. Demanding that their kids are not written off at the age of 2, which happens unfortunately still to so many. And I think that if you really wanted to know what the coalition had achieved more than anything, it's achieved life for people. It's given people a real sense of purpose, a real part in our society, rather than being shut away and marginalised and excluded. But real power, not this empowerment nonsense that comes out of social workers, real power, power that people have taken and are now using. And I think it's impacted in a way that many people don't always remember, because we have knockers and cynics who say all this has happened without the coalition. I defy them to prove that. I defy them to look at any other period in history where the issues of disabled people have been so firmly addressed and put onto the agenda. And it hasn't been there because at no other period in our society's history have we ever had such a powerful group of people together, clearly working for the same aims. Unfortunately, success also breeds problems, and we've got some careerist individuals who now deny history, a bit like people that deny, for example, a whole range of atrocities that have happened throughout history. Well, we've now got our own people that collaborated and still continue to do so and have denied the successes. But we will never lose that, because increasingly we're recording them like this video and making sure that our view is finally recorded and our message will finally be there for prosperity and can't be rewritten out of history, as we've seen throughout decades and decades of other oppressed groups, women, black people, lesbians and gay men, older people, all written out of history, because history is recorded by the rich, by the powerful, solely for their view of what history is.
Yeah, I mean, direct action certainly has blossomed, I suppose, flourished over the last 5 years, but it's been going on for longer than that. I can remember when I first got involved in the coalition, picketing Manchester Town Hall in order to campaign for access to the Town Hall. And seriously embarrassing the City Council, basically, because there was a trades union event going on there, a national trades union event, and the City Council had said that they wouldn't hold any events in the inaccessible Town Hall until it was made accessible, and there they were holding one, so we picketed it and hurried the improvements along a lot, I think, because of that, and stopped them from effectively from holding meetings in the Town Hall. And there have been different actions along the way. Some of them aren't or weren't in direct action in the sense that you recognise it today. I can remember picketing one conference. I think it was called a Conference on Commitment, and it was organised by non-disabled people to allow other non-disabled people basically to come in and state a commitment to fighting on behalf of minority issues, really. What they failed to do, whilst addressing the disability within the conference, what they failed to do was actually involve disabled people, so we went along and again picketed that and leafleted it, but it was a very polite affair then, really. It wasn't sort of a bit of a battle the way direct action is today, really. We handed out leaflets very politely, and the organisers even set up a table for us and brought us tea and buns, you know. It was quite strange, really. But again, it had an effect, and the people there acknowledged that they'd been wrong and went away vowing never to do it again. Whether they did or not, I don't know. But so direct action's been going on for quite a long time, I suppose. It's been going on, well, as long as the disabled people have been coming together to campaign for things, really.
going on from that point, artability wasn't a very polite action, was it? Could you talk about artability a little? And that was probably the first very strong action that happened in the Northwest.
Yeah, artability was a bit of a shock to my system, really, because it happened within about 3 months of me actually becoming a worker with the coalition, and I was very new and very raw and very nervous, and all of a sudden I've got this campaign dumped in my lap, basically. I was sort of designated the coordinator of the thing, which was a lot grander than it sounded. A lot of other people did a lot of the harder work on it.
So, can I just ask you to explain what the artability protest was about, briefly?
Yeah, artability was a conference that was being set up by an organisation called the Carnegie Council. It followed on from a report that had been carried out by Sir Richard Attenborough, nominally anyway, on the arts and disabled people, which had found out, not surprisingly, that disabled people were very disadvantaged in the arts. And they decided not to let it lie down, to stage this conference and invite a lot of influential people within the arts and a lot of people who might fund arts and disability. But again, they forgot to talk to disabled people and include disabled people in anything more than just a very token way. So it was a bit strange, really, because you had some very powerful and influential people actually promoting this thing and putting a lot of pressure on a very new organisation, really, because the coalition really sort of started the ball rolling, I think, in terms of opposing the thing. The more we contacted other groups and told them what was happening, the more other disabled people's groups joined us in opposing the thing. Artability was probably notable, I think, for being one of the first times that disabled people's organisations from around the country that actually networked and supported each other and gained a victory, because we didn't actually have to engage in direct action. The threat of it was enough to make the organisers cancel the conference. The idea of disabled campaigning groups and disabled theatre groups and artists all demonstrating outside a conference that was supposedly set up to speak on our behalf, it was obviously going to be very embarrassing to them, so they cancelled it. It's important to say that we didn't just campaign on a negative basis just to get rid of it. What we wanted to do was to set up a similar kind of conference, which we did do a couple of years later, which actually came out of disabled people's experience, and disabled people organised it and led the thing. And I'm sure that it was a lot more useful than Artability ever would have been.
I've been involved with the coalition almost 10 years now. I had my interview in December 1995 and started the job in January 1985 and started the job in 1986. Well, when I first arrived at the office, there was nothing there. There was no office furniture, no desk, no filing cabinet, no stationery. So that was really my first task, was to actually set the office up with all the necessary and the typewriter. There were no computers then, it was all typewriter. And the first few months, the first 3 months, we worked with the Vice Chair and other members of the Exec Council to secure the funding for another year. So really it was a very busy 3 months, but nothing like the coalition is now, because we were concentrating on setting the office up and on actually securing the funding, the future long-term funding for the organisation.
Apart from the funding, what kind of things are you dealing with?
Well, there was no, what were we dealing with? Well, there was no membership at that time. So it was to really, to recruit members, because membership is a very important part of the coalition, and that's a part that's grown over the years. So initially we set off with just the mailing list that had been used for the open meetings held by the steering group previous to the inaugural meeting.
How long did it take to establish a membership?
I think in the first year we only had about 60 members in the first year. But of course, as the years went on and the coalition became better known, and the word spread, and one friend mentioned it to another, and of course we got more people actually ringing the coalition wanting to become members than us going out to try and recruit members.
And what's the membership now?
The membership currently is about 260. Unfortunately, we have just lost over 100 members this year. Varying reasons, we believe, but possibly a lot of it financial, because a lot of the members we've lost are outside Greater Manchester, and because of our funding, we find it necessary to ask members from outside of Greater Manchester to make a contribution to the information sheet in the magazine. And that's one of the areas that has been cut down, in that people are now having to decide which publication they want, because to have two of them, it's just not possible, it isn't, it's too expensive.
Over that 10 years, what kinds of changes have you seen?
Changes over the last 10 years, quite a lot really, but I think the biggest one has been in staffing and in the number of projects, the areas that we've been involved with. I mean, initially we set out with just producing an information sheet and getting information about the coalition out to membership and to anyone else who we felt, you know, would benefit from it. But we've been setting up projects in the last 10 years, Young Disabled People's Project, Volunteers Project, and I think the most successful of all has been the DAP project, the Disability Action Training Project. And when I think back to all those years ago, when I was one of the 3 people who actually set off with those initial meetings to discuss the research around that project to what it is today, that is an area I feel, you know, the coalition should be very proud of, because it certainly has helped a great deal to make the coalition what it is today.
What other changes do you remember?
Well, changes of office for a start. I suppose we went from being in a shared porter cabin to an industrial unit, and then to 3 industrial units, and then into Carisbrooke. That's sort of one of the changes. But I think probably the most important change is in the, I don't know how I would explain that, in how people see the coalition, how effective we are. Because at first, when we picketed conferences, inaccessible conferences, I think people just used to put up with us, you know, they sort of pat on the head, oh there, you know, you can pick it up, we don't mind, you know, that sort of thing. Whereas now, the coalition's voice has got so well known, the coalition's work has got so well known, that we have people actually ringing in here from other parts of the country, and they say, well, we'd like to hold a conference in Manchester, and we understand that you would know where there is a good accessible venue. Or we've heard people say, we understand that we need to talk to you first, because if we hold it in an accessible venue, then you will picket us. And I think it's because that the work we've done, the information we've put about, the coalition is recognised as one of the best disability organisations in the country.
I've been involved for approximately 5 years, and it's really changed my outlook on life, really. It's meant companionship, it's given me more confidence. It certainly taught me about the difference between the social and medical model, which I didn't know before. And I think the actual politics of disability, I never realised that there was a group of people who disabled themselves who were fighting to change things, and I've joined that group of people, and I now feel great that I'm all part of it.
Brilliant, brilliant, that's it.
I've been involved with the coalition for 2 years now, and it's very important. It's a very important part of my life. Before I actually started working for the coalition, I was a member for just under a year, and actually becoming a member and meeting the people here was a real revelation, because I learned about the social model of disability, and that really helped me become more confident and be able to stand up to the discrimination that I face. Just to get support from other disabled people is really important, and that's really the most important thing for me. You know, to actually have an environment which is safe in terms of being a disabled person.
What? Here's my face.
Yeah.
Can you move away? Right. Can you just go over there to play? Thanks. You want
Do you want me to say that last bit again? It's very important to have an environment as a disabled person that's safe in terms of being with other disabled people. You're not judged in terms of your impairment or any other issue. So you know, that's really important. Okay.
Brilliant. That was really good.
Okay, can I go now, please?
I joined the coalition in 1989, and at first the coalition really didn't mean that much to me. Like, it was an organisation that sent me regular information bulletins, which was very useful, but that was as far as my contact with them. And then maybe I started going to 1 or 2 open meetings, and it started to become like more integral part of my life, and I eventually became a member of the exec, and saw that by, say, people coming together and collectively campaigning, that we could actually make a difference. And getting involved with like the telethon demo, that was, I think, the first really big important thing I was involved with, the part that the coalition had helped organise. And the fact that 2,000 disabled people could actually converge on London and actually make it down to London, not use, well, none of us actually used public transport, I don't think, and and our voices were heard, and that, I think that was actually the last year telethon was run, and the feeling that day was tremendous. And I think, and it's not the big things that I think the coalition can make a difference in. It's actually working away and keep on nudging people to make changes and listen to what disabled people are saying through the Disability Action Training Project and the Young Disabled People's Project. I think that's what the coalition meant to me, is that there is a organisation that represents me and my political ideas. I think that's what it meant to me.
Is that what the sound? Brian was leaning over here a bit.
No, that's fine. You're not rolling yet, are you? No. Right, somebody's desperately waiting for the fan. Right.
Well, you won't be very long, so if you just hold that on your lap, down a bit, that's it, right. Are you relaxed? Are you comfortable?
Yeah.
Right. Are you ready, Neil? Yeah. It does sound alright? Yeah. Okay. Audrey, how long have you been involved with the coalition? I wonder if you can tell me in no words what it meant for you to be a member.
Well, I've been involved with the coalition for the past 5 years now. 5 years this month, to be exact, and it's meant an awful lot to me. We've been involved with other disabled people. You're often segregated away from other disabled people as you go along your lifetime. and grow up with views that it's you that's wrong and it's things that's wrong with you. And until you get involved with a disabled people organisation, you realise that it's not you that's wrong, it's society that's wrong. And since I've been involved with Greater Manchester Coalition Disabled People, it's meant an awful lot to me that I've got strong, I feel good about myself now, and it's just good being around other like-minded people.
Stop the tape for a moment.
Yeah, I think
hang on, just say I remember. When you start, say I remember. It's not ready yet, are we? Yes, we are. So if you just say I remember and then carry on.
It's
Don't
gone.
Don't worry.
Yeah, I remember a time back about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. I'd not long started working as a paid member of staff with GMCDP. All of us actually going on a demo together. Yeah, that felt good. That felt good because we're all involved, all really hyped up about it. It was actually the children in need that were going, doing a demonstration again, and it felt really good. Again, the special memories, all memories like where we've all felt as though we're actually all together and feeling powerful.
Right, stop there. Feeling powerful. Right.
I think the issues facing young disabled people are pretty much the same as those that face all disabled people. It's just for young disabled people, they're often more intensive. And young disabled people are actually living in the situations now that we use as our general experience of disabled people. So for example, in terms of control by parents, family, this is often more intense for young disabled people because all young people want to sort of branch out and leave home and go out with their friends, but young disabled people are often in the position where parents or guardians or whoever have a control over this, and it's not as easy as it is for the non-disabled friends just to go out at night. Access to information as well, I think, is quite sort of paramount importance for young disabled people. Again, all disabled people are denied access to information, whether it be in accessible formats, in accessible places, but for young disabled people, information is often vetted a lot more, whether this is at school or the hospital or wherever, so they don't always get access to information about various services available. Young disabled people generally just aren't taken seriously. Again, all young people have this problem. There's a big movement since the Child Support Act about the vote for children and young people and more rights for young people. And I think for young disabled people, they're sort of even a further step back because they're not consulted around issues and not given a chance to sort of speak out on issues. A lot of young disabled people are currently going through the segregated education system, and this is something we discuss a lot as disabled people. But for all these young people at the moment, they're actually in that system, so it's actually happening now. So I think, again, that's another crucial issue. Excuse me. It's a crucial issue for young people who are in the segregated education system. We draw on our experiences of that system, looking now for issues as other disabled people. Young disabled people are actually going through that system now, so that's another issue. Transport, again, trying to get out in accessible public transport, in accessible housing, peer support, all the same issues that affect disabled people generally.
And once they become involved with GMCDP, how did GMCDP confront those problems and start breaking down those barriers?
Well, GMCDP has 2 projects working with young disabled people. The first of these is the Young Disabled People's Forum, which operates in the Manchester area. and it's a chance for young people to come together to talk about these issues and hopefully influence service providers and actually say to people who are in control, this is the sort of service we want. And this project came about through the independent living skills courses that were organised previously at Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People, which looked at all issues from transport, employment, education, personal development, and how young people could get more control over their lives. So that's one level of involvement. The other is through the Young Disabled People's Advice and Resource Centre, which is a project for young disabled people in the Greater Manchester area, again offering a chance to sort of come on different training courses, drop-in days, and explore a variety of these issues that young people just aren't given access to. For example, sexuality, sort of issues around sexuality, something that's certainly looking at. Young people often aren't given any sort of sex education within special schools, and there's this big sort of myth that disabled people are asexual beings anyway, so it's quite a big barrier to overcome. Recent work with young people has shown that sort of actually getting a chance to meet people, to form relationships is a big issue, so that's certainly one area. And a lot of it's looking at confidence building and sort of empowerment and just having a bit more confidence to actually sort of discuss independence. And it's not just independence as getting your own flat, it could be more independence where you're living at the moment.
Good question. What were the early projects?
Dat was first.
Pardon?
Dat was first.
I can't hear you.
Dat was the first.
Dat?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's
What was
dat.
that?
Well, one of the early projects would be DAT, which has now been renamed as the Disability Action Training.
Oh, right.
We had grant money to develop the project to see how successful it could become. So its early days was not one of self-financing, it was one of self-discovery and building our own confidences up. But since then, we've moved on and that is still thriving. But other projects have come and other projects have gone. We are, as you're well aware, we're now very much in a kind of service provision grant society, where a kind of contract mode where you can receive grant money for fulfilling a contract. And that contract may last 2 years, 3 years, and then it ends. So for the coalition, it's a constant onward renegotiating of new contracts and old contracts to keep the coalition going.
Was it a struggle to start feeding into local authorities and getting disabled people's issues taken on board by the boroughs in Greater Manchester? How does that work?
Well, the coalition has always been involved with the local authorities, particularly in the city of Manchester. The relationship hasn't been as good necessarily with other boroughs, and it's more to do with accident of history, I'd say, than anything else, in that it's very hard for an organisation to push a local authority in a direction it doesn't want to go. But once a local authority has decided an issue is important, then we are in a position to influence it, to make sure that the policy it implements is a correct policy. And in the early years, Manchester City Council had a number of ideas around equal opportunities, employment of disabled people, which they hadn't thoroughly thought out at the time. They just had these ideas, and that gave us an opportunity to campaign, to pressure, to work with them, to change what they were going to do so that they would still achieve the aims they wanted to achieve, but it would actually be a more worthwhile product at the end of it. And one of the big fights and one of the big victories in that area is the idea of jobs reserved for disabled people. When there was the equal opportunity posts being done in the council, the council said that it would be illegal to reserve any jobs for disabled people. And we pointed out that it wasn't, and kept on pointing out that it wouldn't be illegal. And in the end, their legal department had to concede that it wasn't illegal. And we ended up having the first disabled people employed in the council in disabled reserve posts. And the relationship has gone on from there, whether it's been access or transport. When the council has decided to move in a direction, we've been quick to put the pressure on to encourage them to do the right thing.
Right. Well, when the coalition was first established, my role was as deputy chair. I wasn't employed initially by the coalition. I was involved in the recruitment of the two original posts. That's the admin worker, who's still there after 10 years, so it must be okay, and the information worker, who worked for about 8 years, I think, in that post, 7 or 8 years, I may be wrong. So I was involved in that, and the last post of the first 3 to be recruited was the development worker post, and I was really interested in that, but very unsure as to whether or not I'd be able to do it. But the timing of it was quite good for me, because it kind of coincided with when my youngest child started school, and so it all seemed to fit in very nicely. So I applied for that, and I was the coalition's no, I wasn't the first development worker, because we'd had a partial employment of Neville Strowger as a kind of job share to make sure that the funding was secure. So in truth I was the second development worker, but I was kind of full term, whereas Neville had been part-time for a limited period. And I think I remember writing in the annual report, the first bit that I did about my first day, like, here I am, what shall I develop? Because I didn't really, I wasn't really clear on what my role was exactly, except that it seemed the organisation needed developing and the membership needed developing, and it wasn't really reactive, not totally, because I think we had a framework and we knew what we wanted to do. But it was probably difficult to prioritise what we did, because there was so much. So in that sense, we probably reacted a certain extent to issues. So I did kinds of membership recruitment drives. We did quite a structured project in Bolton that I did. I did work on setting long-term plans and objectives for the organisation, work on developing different funding sources so that we could expand the work that we did, and work on helping the development of the organisation itself, getting good working structures, good working practices. And we worked very much as a team in that.
I think maybe, what I wanted to say that really about my role was probably being in, it's that cliche about being in the right place at the right time, meeting the right people, and having access to resources, and in a strange kind of way, International Year of Disabled People, although it meant nothing as a year, as we know, it actually provided a focus to be looking at what should go on in the county, and all those things came together. But really, it would never have survived if certain key disabled people hadn't been around and prepared to have the vision. That was actually what was the important thing. It wasn't me. It was the vision that certain people had, that I was able to sort of bring together, that actually meant it survived. Because there were other areas where there were people who were given resources to coordinate all kinds of events that year, on a much bigger scale than maybe in the County of Greater Manchester. But things didn't survive, and maybe the thing why they didn't survive is there weren't those key people who got that sense of vision, that sense in the belief of the sort of, the quality of life issues for disabled people, who were willing to work very hard to actually sort of promote those and promote them. And it was very enjoyable too, because that was it. I suppose it was enjoyable. It's like anything, when you convene a meeting, it's often important that people do turn up. And we were very fortunate that meetings were packed out. Even when we convened a meeting at the beginning of 1992 to look at what had happened, And we deliberately asked Alf Morris to come along because he was a Greater Manchester MP. Because although many people were critical of his role, we thought, well, we needed to juxtapose him alongside disabled people. And I can remember we really packed County Hall out that night. It was standing room only, with the Lord Lieutenant sharing it. But we had two key disabled people, Ken Davis and Ken Lumb, sort of juxtaposed with the MPs. And I think that was one night when really people began to see this is something different, because Alf Morris was actually not the key figure at the end of that night at all. It was, and suddenly I think people saw we don't necessarily need, we can do it ourselves. I mean, that was it. And it was quite a salutary lesson, certainly for him, but I think for other people there, that, you know, this is something that our spokespeople was actually far more articulate than these MPs on behalf, and everybody lined up behind those people. So I think that was quite a key evening, I think, really. And then we had Judy Hewen over from the Centre for Independent Living in the States. She came over, and we weren't sure of the turnout again that evening because it was a fairly new concept. And yet we must have ended up in the end with about 70 people. It was at the Polytechnic. Came to actually listen to her, and what was interesting in the end, because they were very much about direct action in the States then, people actually came out of that meeting and said, well, I don't know, could I sit in the road? And really people had, it was still questioning it, but it had given, you know, it had given them something to actually think about. You know, people saying, I'd have to remember to take my tablets with me if I'm going to be stuck overnight. But it was good, the energy that people, I think, had then.
Telethon was probably the arch enemy, if you like. It was the perfect target because it typified so much of disabled people's oppression, the images that it used, the patronising way that it treated disabled people generally, and the whole charitable ethos, the whole idea that Telethon funded things basically which either should have been provided as of right, things like transport and special equipment, and partly things that really worked against what we'd have been campaigning for. Things that I mentioned transport, a lot of the things were segregated forms of transport, segregated projects and schemes. So disabled people found it very easy to identify that as a target to campaign against, really. And the first big demonstration against Telethon was in 1990. I went along to that, and there were maybe 300 or 400 people there, but creating a lot of havoc, serious havoc outside the London Weekend television headquarters. And we said then that we'd be back the next time if Telethon carried on. And 2 years later, we were back, and there were 2,000, 3,000 disabled people there then. I couldn't get to the second demonstration, but I got some sort of wonderful memories of the first one. I think I remember a song that we sung, which went, "We'll make Chris Tarrant weave a basket every day while Telethon goes on." And I have this picture in my head still of this policeman, where disabled people were sort of wheeling across the road. Wheelchair users were wheeling across the road to block traffic, and the police actually took to grabbing hold of the backs of people's wheelchairs and pushing them off. And those disabled people that could, in response to that, then started throwing themselves out of wheelchairs and lying down in the road. And I've got this wonderful picture in my head of this policeman sort of holding this empty wheelchair, looking down at someone in the road, you know, with this sort of expression on his face, God, what have I done? You know, I mean, what do I do now? You know, it was very new. Direct action was very new to the police then. I think it was probably quite new to a lot of the disabled people who were involved, but it's very new to the police, and they weren't quite sure how to handle it. I think as times have moved on and disabled people have started demonstrating more and more and more, the police have got more and more sophisticated in the techniques for bottling disabled people up, I suppose, and trying to pack them into corners and packs and things. It's getting much harder now to outwit the police, if you like, because they've obviously thought about how they're going to deal with disabled people.
There were a lot of things that were happening. People had quite a lot of energy in those days. I was reasonably mobile. Most of my friends that were not mobile, and there was lots of issues around how people got to meetings. I think I was probably a noddy driver at the time, but I can't quite remember that, and probably got my first car, which I could sort of use and take people, which I did a lot of that in the sport. I took a lot of people around. I enjoyed that, showing people got to where they wanted to go. Involvement stemmed from the meeting in Salford and listening to the issues. There was 2 or 3 spokespeople on that day of about disabled people. They were going through charters. They were going through a lot of crap, some of them as well. You know, there was one guy who spoke sense, and 2 or 3 of them were just waffling on. And there's probably a doctor involved in the waffling. And from then there was quite an involvement and issues raised around groups that used to meet at Greater Manchester Council for Voluntary Services headquarters, which is St Thomas's. And it was easy for us to meet there because we got a certain backup then and support from the field officers. The freedom, and there was a housing, as far as I remember, there was a housing conference at, I think I'm correct in saying, County Hall, which had people coming from national organisations, and a lot of it was around disability issues. There'd been a housing disability group formed in Rochdale, and issues around that I think helped to put this conference on. It was an all-day conference, and there was people that visited from Cheshire Homes, a Cheshire home in Hampshire, and gave us their experiences on breaking out of a group of residents got together and they did a breakaway. There was starting to do filming on a kind of independent living, where we used the Grove Road scheme in Derbyshire. We went along there and filmed. We commissioned somebody to do video of this film that was put together on people's experiences, and I was involved a little bit in that, mostly driving people to Derbyshire and so on. And there was issues that, you know, people that made video was a very new thing in those days. It was, where do you find somebody? There was costs involved. That was interesting, and they were supportive, the people that made the video, and that's still on record, hopefully. And that was done mostly at Grove Road, and some of it was done in my flat when I lived in Trafford. We got very involved then in joining up with the UPS group, which I assume was Greater Manchester, and we had lots of involvement in that. We also got MDA was still running, the Disabled Athlete. We'd changed the name by then of MDA. We'd made it a bit more political. We'd gone through the Charity Commission and changed all that business and all the constitution. So we'd got a good background of disabled people's organisations.
So once GMCDP was formed, what was your involvement then with the organisation?
I suppose right from the word go, making contacts with individuals who we'd never heard of it, just sort of picking people up. But in relation to that, we were also very involved in UPS, so we had meetings, the UPS meetings, and somewhere along the line, a couple of years later, came the Equal Ops set up in with Manchester City Council, so I was involved in that too. And I think there were times when we had 4 evening meetings a week, and that was being quite a strain on people. But there was a core of very committed people, and I think it was just networking and recognising that the decision would be made that there'd be a Greater Manchester Coalition of Disabled People.
I think the impact is that you've got a focus, a meeting place where disabled people who want to change society for the better can actually get together and meet. So you've got an organisation which allows disabled people to come into it and meet other disabled people and to do things from that base. It's also been a means whereby we've been able to spread ideas and information through developing the organisation and through disseminating the information that we get to disabled people. So it's been supporting their campaigns and activities as well as generating our own through the organisation. And I think that we've promoted collective activity. The idea of collective activity in a democratic, or at least attempting to be democratic about it, we've actually promoted that idea that collective action is going to achieve more in the long run than separate individuals doing their own things. And I think over the past 15 years, society in a sense has been going in the opposite direction. It's been encouraging or making it easier for people to operate as individuals, do their own thing. And I think that our promoting a kind of an organisation and promoting collective activity and holding together, not breaking up, I think that's been quite an achievement over the past 15 years.
And what place do you see GMCDP having in the future with the changing legislation for disabled people and possibly a more difficult political arena to negotiate? More complicated arena?
Well, I think that at the moment the situation is where there's at last been a recognition that it isn't in our interest to side with traditional organisations for disabled people who are supporting the government's, or who have been supporting the government's so-called anti-discrimination bill. And I think that has at last been realised. What we've been trying to say over the past 2 or 3 years at least, is that organisations of disabled people should be actually clear what we want in terms of anti-discrimination legislation and campaign for it on our own without getting intermingled in such things as Rights Now campaigns and what have you. I think that division is just about the association with those organisations and the mistake in associating with them. I think it's just about being realised, and we've been trying to actually say that it was a mistake over the past few years. So I think we can think more clearly now about the kind of legislation we want and the means of actually achieving that. And it's going to be done in a kind of a different political climate, because there's an election approaching, and we obviously don't know which kind of party is going to be in government. So what I think that we need to do is to increase the support of disabled people and other groups, and to be actually clearer about what it is that we're going to actually push for when the actual situation in terms of who's going to be the next government is sorted out. What's the situation with this government is over with. They've got their legislation, they're going to try and implement it, and they're going to get the support of as many voluntary organisations as they can. And obviously we don't want groups of disabled people to be won over, if you like. So I think our major task within the next months or so will be to cement the opposition to the government's bill and then move into support for the alternative, what we are going to be campaigning.
I think a lot of the movement came about sort of through theorising and looking at the historical situation of disabled people. And I don't think it always comes across in sort of a young people friendly language. I don't like to say I'm patronising, but I think there's a lot of ideologies and philosophies behind, say, the social model of disability, which really don't come across as being very sort of amenable or very, very usable. I think it's crucial that young disabled people are involved in the movement because obviously young disabled people today are the disabled people's movement of tomorrow, and I think the movement has to look at sort of its access generally, and it's not just access to young disabled people. I know the movement's opening up to people with a number of impairments who didn't sort of identify with the movement before. But I think actually looking at the situation of young disabled people and how they can be involved, so translating the social model of disability into something that's more understandable, so something realistic. So, for example, talking practically about how the social model of disability affects our lives. I know now there are more young disabled people involved, for example, a Direct Action Network, which is only one way of speaking out about our rights, but it's a sort of more exciting way and a way that a lot of young people would identify more with. I think for a lot of young disabled people, the disabled people's movement is a statement. I think it's hard to actually put your finger on what it actually is. I think a lot of young people might come into Greater Manchester Coalition as one part of the movement, and they come in to get a particular course, to come on a particular course, to meet people, and don't see it as a wider movement. It's just an organisation of disabled people. And I think we have to start at that level and get across that we are one organisation that is part of a much bigger organisation. Because a lot of young people obviously have been brought up very much on the charity ethos and the special trips syndrome. So they're used to being, they're used to going along to various organisations and being given activities to do. So I think we have to start with, we have to draw that distinction between these sort of organisations and organisations such as GMCDP. And I think by starting on that level, by showing young disabled people that we are disabled people offering services, and they should be services that they want. So getting it to it on that direct level, sort of rather than giving somebody a pamphlet on this is the disabled people's movement, I think it sort of starts at the level, sort of the grassroots, if you like, actually working with young people who live within Greater Manchester.
Because without change, we all wither, we all die. We always change to survive, and the Coalition's no different. The organisation's been through some wonderful times, had some great victories, but we've also had some catastrophic defeats. We've also had some many internal wrangles and disagreements. But that's life. That's what I think we have to accept, is that we are now in the same position as everyone else, that we're going to make mistakes, that we're going to have very high expectations placed upon us. When we get it wrong, we've got to hold our hands up and admit we've got it wrong, learn from it and move on. When we get things right, we need to get up on that rooftop and bloody shout it as loud as we can, because we are now in the stage where we are very influential, we're very powerful, and we've got to sort of now learn how to operate as an emerged organisation rather than an emerging organisation. But change in itself is nothing new. That, as I say, that the organisation has constantly changed and will constantly change. The whole of life is about change. What I'm pleased to say is the Coalition is still here to have that sort of discussion. I think the main thing about being involved in the Coalition for me was, obviously, it was through the Coalition that I met Cathy, and that probably the single most important part of my life. But Kathy was just an example of, if you like, the spirit of the organisation, someone that had been absolutely knocked from pillar to post by the society that we live in until then, but who wasn't bitter, wasn't angry, wasn't twisted, was someone that believed that we would one day get it right. And if anything, I think it's that belief that life has a purpose, that we have something to go for, that despite all the shit that we get all the time, that there is a point to it all. And that, if you like, that belief that it isn't what we do today for ourselves, it's what we're doing tomorrow for the people that follow us. But in the interim, having fun, because despite all the problems and all the other things that have gone on over the last 10 years, the coalition is still fun to be involved with, because if it wasn't, let's face it, then what would be the point of continuing? But it is, it's fun, it gives us all a sense of purpose, and more importantly, to me, it's shown qualities in people that I just never believed existed. And there are people that are very self-effacing and deprecating within the organisation, but at the end of the day, I think it really is about the sense of family, if you like, that many of us never had through our traditional families, because we didn't fit in, because we didn't have disabled parents. And I know that some of the more senior members in the organisation, I'm afraid I do look upon as my mum and dad, my uncles, my aunties, my brothers and sisters.